Azerbaijan hosted this year's World Environment Day under the theme Inspired by Nature for Climate for Our Future. Yet conflicts, soaring food and fuel prices on top of extreme weather events have only intensified the ongoing climate crisis.
Extreme heat alone is already one of the deadliest climate hazards we face. An El Nino event could intensify the threat on average. More heat-related illness, wider spread of vector-borne diseases, increased pressure on food and water systems, and communities that were already struggling will be pushed further beyond their limits.
A sobering assessment. So what regions are facing the greatest risks, and what can we all do collectively to mitigate the impact of a worsening climate crisis? To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guest. Lisa Sachs, the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment and an associate professor at Columbia Climate School. Lisa, welcome to the program. A lot of conversation, a lot of talk this year over this climate phenomenon known as El Nino. What do we know about this weather system and how it will impact the world? Why are people so concerned?
I think a lot of people are concerned, actually, those who follow the climate and understand the implications of El Nino. This is, of course, not the first El Nino. We've had past El Ninos, which gives us a sense of what to expect. It is a period of even greater intensified warming, which intensifies the, not just warming, but extreme weather patterns in different parts of the world. So it affects different parts of the world differently. In some places, there is a much higher risk of extreme floods, in other places droughts, in other places extreme heat. So it is very concerning. I have to say, we don't have to wait for the El Nino to experience very concerning weather patterns. They're happening every day. We just went through a major heat wave both in the US, and then I was in London, in Europe, where it was extremely hot. So I think we all know that we're in extremely concerning times.
And what will it mean moving forward for here in the United States?
The United States is so confused, frankly, because nothing about our policy is responding to what we're actually experiencing. So I don't know, I can't say with any confidence that having more extreme weather will wake anyone up, or actually I should say it won't wake up the leadership and those in decision-making power to what are very obvious steps that we could be taking to reduce the global risk, the global incidence of extreme weather patterns, and to protect our communities at home and to prepare for the inevitable disasters. So what will happen in the US, I don't know. What I can say, though, to pick up on the Azerbaijan theme of inspiration is that what I do find the two worlds that we live in is that the trajectories for mitigation and for avoiding these cataclysmic effects of climate change are well within reach. We know the transition pathways, the costs of the technologies have plummeted so much that actually the decarbonized systems are now more compelling, more affordable in most contexts. So it is absolutely well within reach that we could be decarbonizing our global economy. Why we don't is a combination of confusion, of politics, of the coordination that's needed, of structural mechanisms, some of those eminently solvable, some of them very complicated. But I do find it inspiring to reflect on the fact that solutions are well within reach.
I want to get to something you said, pick up on that a little bit later on, and that's really the policies of the Trump administration. But let's put that on the back burner for now and talk about these gatherings and conferences like the one in Azerbaijan. We've seen them in different parts of the world. How much progress, Lisa, do these conversations, do these gatherings, beyond commitments, beyond promises, beyond words, do they truly make in turning those words into action? Seems to be the hard part, is what I'm trying to say here.
I think you're exactly right, and it's so worthwhile to reflect on that and what these gatherings are, why they're important, but also what they're not and what they can't achieve. And then we can use them for what they are and preserve their importance, but not expect them to deliver outcomes that they're not designed to achieve. I find it very important that we continue to have fora where the world's governments can get together and have discussions on making commitments, on trajectories, and so on. But these are not designed to be where we design solutions, nor where we implement them. And so much of what the actors, the public and private institutions that are needed to actually implement what is needed are not in the room in these fora. These are not designed to be technical convenings where we're figuring out structurally what's possible, what do we need, which institutions need to evolve, and so on. That's not what these convenings are meant to do. So in my view, how we should understand them is that they are meant to, actually, let me take what we should do to prepare for them, is to understand the solutions and to engage with the different institutions, public and private, localized, regional, and international, the coalition of relevant parties that can actually work on practical solutions, and then bring those to the convenings and say, see, this is what it looks like in practice to implement. We should have political commitments to scaling this, to replicating this, to supporting this, and so on. But I do think we've fallen into a pattern of expecting these large convenings to come up with solutions and then to be able to implement them. And they're not designed to do that. And so we need to find the solutions elsewhere.
Yeah, and how much confidence do you have in the United Nations? Let me look at my notes. The United Nations General Assembly formally, Lisa, backed a landmark advisory opinion only, that basically says that countries have an obligation under international law to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change. Is this significant when it's non-binding, mostly symbolic here?
I think it is significant because it reflects the completely pervasive understanding of most of the civilized world. Leave aside those of us that are not in civilized parts of the world. But it reflects the fact that the world's governments recognize that this is an imperative and an obligation. But we shouldn't confuse a non-binding political statement, as important as that is, as sufficient to doing the hard work then to getting it done. So it doesn't mean that we come back the next year and say, what? There was this commitment and now there's this gap analysis. There wasn't accountability. There wasn't, it wasn't serious. No, it's that this now needs to be translated into action. We need to understand actually what does it mean to design optimized, decarbonized energy systems, cities, to figure out what this actually looks like in practice. That's technical, it's policy, it's financial. So now we need to do the hard work to reflect what the governments have almost unanimously recognized to be an important global goal.
And of course, another major issue in all of this is climate finance. I mean, so many countries, smaller countries that are the most vulnerable, simply don't have the resources for programs or initiatives to fight climate change.
I find this, of course, this is what I spend morning till night doing now on my side. I find it to be a very frustratingly confused space, because first, let me just say that the challenge of decarbonization, which is the main global challenge because everything else is managing its impacts, the downstream impacts, which are already here. But to decarbonize the world's economy, we have the technology that we need and we have the capital we need. The challenge is one of allocation. It's not that we don't have the capital. The other thing that's so important to understand is that in decarbonized energy systems and mobility and in buildings and in industry, this is where the private sector can and should finance. These are revenue generating activities. When they don't, it's because structurally there are biases or structural problems or risks are not properly allocated or they're seen as too costly and so on. Those are solvable structural problems. So emerging markets and developing countries, they have been at the blunt end of a completely biased international financial architecture for decades. This is not a climate challenge. This is an international finance challenge, that things that should be eminently financeable in emerging markets are perceived as too high risk, as too costly, when they shouldn't. These are the fastest growing economies and these are good investments. That is all that can and should be structurally fixed. But of course, we know some of the large players that are standing in the way. But on the other side, the financing needed for resilience, for protecting communities from the impacts of these extreme events, for rebuilding communities after storms, that is not financeable by the private sector. And that is where you're right. The developing countries absolutely don't have the financing for this. And any financing will come at the expense of already what is paltry financing for their basic needs, for meeting the needs of the rest of their communities. That's where the international community that has created this crisis in the first place, the developed countries, have an obligation to ensure adequate, affordable financing for resilience and for loss and damage. And of course, the world has not stepped up to that responsibility.
We're running out of time, but I have to ask you a question about the biggest economy in the world, and that, of course, is where we all live here in the United States. As you know, the Trump administration, the first time around and again the second time around, they pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. We've seen sweeping rollbacks of federal environmental and climate protections. Clearly, this doesn't appear to be a priority for this administration. How worried are you? How concerning is this? And what are the implications?
I'm worried and I'm concerned, and it's incredibly distressing. And most of the population in this country doesn't support what this government is doing, even those on the ground, even those, I mean, especially those that are affected by the fact that we're already feeling wildfires and heat and all sort of devastating impacts here, but also that just the complete regulatory mayhem makes operating, doing business, investing in the US very complicated. So it's very damaging and it's very distressing. That said, there's leadership in other parts of the world, China, in Asia, in other large economies. China's already stepping up. It's their technological advances that have made the transition possible. So the US can't hold the rest of the world back. And I hope that the rest of the world can show the US what it looks like to get things done without the US. And I hope with new informed leadership in the US, we can rejoin the club of trying to actually figure out how we protect the planet for all of our benefit.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Lisa Sachs, as always, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Africa has felt the severe shocks of climate change due to lack of food, water, aid, and critical resources, with conflicts and economic instability worsening the situation. Joining me now is Abdullahi Boru Halakhe. He's an Africa security and policy analyst. Abdullahi, welcome to the program. Across Africa, food insecurity and displacement, we have to be honest, these are not new problems, but climate change and conflict, of course, are making things a lot worse. Where are you seeing the greatest impact?
Thank you so much. I think now what we are seeing is more than ever, climate change is the primary driver of displacement. 3 out of 4 people who are displaced are primarily because of the climate change, whether it's drought, whether it's famine, or whether it's because of flooding. A good example, just to use Somalia, is the ground zero of that. If you look at the amount of greenhouse gases that Africa in total is emitting, it's less than 2%. And the number of people who are displaced are going up. The amount of money to fight this is completely, I think it was around 12%. Now with aid money going out of the system, that is significantly very difficult. So you look at a country like Somalia that doesn't produce a ton of carbon dioxide or the greenhouse gases, but now, as of January, probably close to 200 people have been displaced, over 6 million people are in need of humanitarian aid. And finally, this crisis of climate change, particularly displacement, affects women disproportionately. Over 60%, around 65%, are women who are displaced.
Are you getting the sense that the world is paying any attention to what's going on in Somalia? I mean, there are so many things happening around the world. It seems that climate change and conflicts in places like Somalia are being overshadowed by other issues.
Indeed. I think the Norwegian Refugee Council published yesterday some of the 10 conflicts that are being neglected. But I think neglected does a lot of heavyweight lifting. The reality is, in places like Somalia, in places like South Sudan, in places like the DRC, conflict are part and parcel of how some of the problems in these regions have been negotiated. However, the pathway is not necessarily using the gun or the battlefield. The process of resolving that is diplomatic. However, the diplomatic capacity of many of the institutions have been rendered almost impotent. Give an example of the DRC. The United States is involved in resolving the crisis in the eastern part of DRC. However, the primary lens through which they are doing that is conflict for peace and diplomacy. That is fairly extractive, and that doesn't solve the problem in the medium and long term.
You talked about the United Nations. The World Food Program issued a statement about how grave the situation is in Somalia. Take a listen.
These are families who've been displaced because of the drought that is racking the entire country. 3 failed rainy seasons mean that these folks have had to leave their homes behind because their livelihoods have gone. Their cattle or their goats, their sheep, cannot find pasture land.
What are people like United Nations or the World Food Program, how much resources do they have, Abdullahi, to help these people who are suffering?
I think sometimes when it is reduced to a political football, the dismantling of USAID, where the United States contributes something around 40% of all humanitarian support, that is gone out of the system. That is not the problem. The problem is in 2011, Somalia had a famine. By the time famine was formally declared, the process is slightly slow. At least a half of slightly over 250,000 people who died have died. Why? Because many of the humanitarian groups were afraid of running afoul of counterterrorism laws, especially the United States and other Western countries, so they pulled out. And the areas that were disproportionately affected were areas in al-Shabaab controlled areas. However, in 2017, when the same situation was obtained, humanitarian groups moved very quickly, put cash in people's hands, and famine was averted. We learned the lesson from 2011 that were implemented in 2017. Now, those lessons have completely been forgotten, and we are slow walking into a potential famine in Somalia. And that is the problem. The problem is it's not just aid, it's how quick aid can get into the hands of people. And humanitarian groups are very good at doing that, but they need the resources. World Food Program said it's 3 failed rain season. These people have been moving from one part to another part. Their source of livelihood, which is livestock, cattle, sheep, and goat, all of them have been decimated, most of them. That means they don't have any other form of livelihood. Aid would have bridged that gap. Aid is no longer there. So these are people who are just waiting to really face the ultimate prize.
Let me move on to the Ebola outbreak in the DRC, which has put such tremendous strain on an already vulnerable country. And of course, they're dealing with violence and conflict as well. And there's so much distrust among the people there with these aid workers coming in. Many aid facilities have been attacked. To talk about what's going on there and how climate shocks and conflict make it harder to prevent and contain diseases like Ebola.
I think Ebola in the eastern part of DRC is a perfect metaphor of the reality in the DRC. The reason why I'm saying that is in the DRC, we've had, I think this is probably the 7th Ebola outbreak. Of course, this is a different strain, the Bujubuju strain, and we don't have vaccine for it compared to the Zaire strain. However, now, because in many of those areas where there is an outbreak of the disease, there is a trust deficit, not just between the citizens and the government, but also between the citizens and humanitarian groups, where many in those regions say, what is it that we are getting? But the humanitarian groups can only go so far because they are fairly apolitical. At political level, many of the people in the areas that have seen the outbreak have significant trust between them.
Why is that, Abdullahi? Why is there so little trust for these aid workers who are actually trying to make a difference here?
Because, for instance, the DRC has got one of the largest UN peacekeeping and probably also the oldest peacekeeping operation at a budget of, I think, around 1 billion a year. But for many people in the DRC, where I was there 2 years ago, in Goma area, they are asking, you are here, you have all these equipments, you have not solved my problem, so why are you here? It's the question that they are asking. But I think that is an information gap. They don't understand the limitations and constraints within which they, humanitarian workers, UN peacekeeping workers operate. But on the other hand, people who do not work within the same constraint, in the eastern part of DRC, we have close to 100,000 rebel movement, and they're going about, rampaging, raping, and pillaging the area. That makes it very difficult, and that is where the government comes in. The government needs to be doing these functions. It's not doing. It's not only not doing its primary function, it is not also helping in putting out information that people will trust. What does that lead to? Rumors. What does that lead to? Conspiracy theories, and that is probably more dangerous than Ebola itself in any public health outbreak.
Yeah, I know we went off topic a little bit talking about Ebola, but they are all kind of connected. And let me move on finally to COP31, which is going to take place in Turkey in November. Abdullahi, what do you want to see come out of this conference?
I think what many African countries would like to see, especially at the community level, is less talk and more action. We know where the problems are. The bridging of the gap, all right, or around the loss and damage fund that was put out during the previous COP, that needs to be implemented. People are not interested in sermons. People know that for many African countries, they view climate change, while it's a natural occurrence, they view it through the justice lens. For a farmer or for a pastoralist in South Central Somalia who has lost all his stock, it doesn't matter all the righteous indignation and speeches that many will come and give. But what we are dealing with right now is climate change has almost become a dirty word. US has moved, has pulled out of the climate change accord, and many countries, you've seen it in the United Arab Emirates, as well as the previous COP. These are countries that significantly rely on hydrocarbons, and they are the ones who are hosting, while at the same time polluting. So it is very difficult, but for many of African countries and communities, it is a hope against hope that people will come to their senses and see these communities need to be helped because they didn't cause this crisis.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
India is reeling from unbearable heat with no respite as air quality, water availability, livelihoods and health are strained. Chidanand Rajghatta joins me now. He's a foreign editor and the U.S. bureau chief for the Times of India. Chidanand, boy, India has quite scorching weather recently. At one point, the 50 hottest cities in the world were in India in just a single day. And of course, there's lack of fuel and water. How are people dealing with it? What is going on?
The world is experiencing immense, heat, and India is right there at the very top. And it's been relentless, and all this happens at a time when we have a president in the U.S. who thinks global warming or climate change is a hoax, and Indians are doing the best. And all this is aggravated, of course, by multiple crises, including the war in the Gulf, the lack of fuel. It's a terrible time, not just in India but across South Asia and pretty much across the world. So last week you had Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, visiting India when it was really hot, and actually I think this past week we have had Tiffany Trump, President Trump's daughter, also visiting India, and they're going there when the temperatures are at 100 and 110 and 115. And the most striking thing that caught my eye was Marco Rubio and a bunch of foreign visitors, all dressed in heavy suits in 100, 110 degrees heat. So apparently the message hasn't reached people that you dress lightly when there's heat. But yes, this is a crisis, and it from all evidence it looks like it's going to get worse.
So what is the Indian government doing to handle this heat, to handle and address the challenges that come with extreme conditions and extreme heat, and sometimes monsoon rain, sometimes fires? But in India, it seems to be the monsoon rains and the scorching heat. Is the government doing enough?
Well, not a whole lot, as best as I can see, other than putting out social media messages saying, please drink more water, hydrate yourself, and so on. But look, there's not a whole lot the government itself can do, other than passing out advisories. I think it's also incumbent on people to, manage. For instance, this simple thing of how they dress, what clothes to wear, what foods to eat. But also, I think the leadership has to come from, the United States, the major emitters, the major, global organizations, the United Nations. There seems to be no sense of urgency. And particularly in the U.S., I mean, this is a country that has completely given up on issues like this. I mean, you have a president who thinks green energy is a scam and that global warming is a scam. So there's not a whole lot that you can do, and the biggest emitters and the biggest causes of this heat have thrown up their hands, and you have the president, promoting coal. He calls it clean, beautiful coal. So yeah, it's
well, Chidanand, let's be honest. India is also the world's third largest greenhouse gas emitters. It has some responsibilities here. It has set a goal of reducing those emissions to 47% below 2005 levels by 2035. How realistic is that goal for India?
Very realistic, and in fact, India is one of the fastest, countries which have developed renewable energy. I mean, the solar program in India is immense. It's moving fast, so is the wind. But here's by the way, there's a very clever argument that India is the third largest emitter. Please consider emission in terms of per capita, right? It's a country of 1.4 billion people, right? By that standard, India is one of the lesser emitters. And I think India and China are doing pretty well in terms of, renewable energy. And, it's the United States which has, given up on this front.
Well, finally, let me move on to what's happening in the Middle East. You have the war with Iran. We've got a conflict in Lebanon, the Strait of Hormuz, which is a vital waterway for global energy supplies. That has been disrupted. What are the stakes for a country like India if this conflict drags on and on?
Oh, enormous. India was significantly dependent on energy from the Persian Gulf, if I'm not mistaken, up to 50% of its crude, and more than 50% of its gas used to come from the Persian Gulf. But India, I think, has learned a lesson. It was always, its supplies were always diversified. I think at one point, India was buying energy from about 25 countries across the world. But now I think that number has gone up to 40. India is buying energy from as distant a country as Norway, Nigeria, and Venezuela. We had the new leader of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, who was in New Delhi yesterday and day before. So India is trying to diversify. And I think this is a very salutary lesson, not just to India, but to many countries that, you never know when the spigot gets turned off. And that's what happened in the Persian Gulf. And right now, India is going, to far corners of the world to look for energy. But fundamentally, I think India has now realized that it has to try and be as self-sufficient as possible. So they're ramping up both exploration, production of gas, and, of course, the renewables program like solar and wind energy.
And we need to leave it there. Chidanand Rajghatta, thanks for joining us. And I'm Asya Namdar in Washington. Thank you for watching another edition of The Heat.